Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to entertain a question most never dare to ask. What if the ancient myths we once called legends were actually memories, echoes from a time so far back it slipped from history and into story? Titans, skyships, floods, and fire, were they metaphors, or were they fragments of a civilization older than we imagined? One not lost to time, but buried beneath it. What if the gods of Olympus, the flying chariots of India, and the sunken lands of lore were distorted recollections of real events, distorted but not invented? This isn't just about what we know. It's about what we've forgotten, and what might still be hidden in plain sight. And while you're settling in, before your eyes grow too heavy, I'd love it if you gently tapped subscribe or pressed the little hype button YouTube recently added. It's a small click, but it helps keep these experiments and explorations orbiting out into the algorithm. You can also leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the night. It's oddly fascinating to see where people are drifting off with us, scattered across the world like stars across the galaxy. Now take a deep breath, let your day drift away, and let's travel together into the quiet corners of the universe. Long before history had a name, before ink touched parchment or numbers carved time into stone, humans told stories. They whispered them by firelight, painted them on cave walls, etched them into the shapes of gods and monsters. And though the names change and the details shift, a strange pattern emerges. Cultures separated by vast oceans and endless deserts speak of the same events, the same sky falling, the same sea rising, the same visitors descending from above. In every direction, the stories echo. In ancient Mesopotamia, the gods warned of a great flood, instructing a man to build a vessel and carry life within it. Thousands of miles away, the Hopi tell of waters that rose to swallow the world, sparing only those who followed the guidance of beings from the stars. The Chinese recalled a time when the heavens cracked open and fire fell, while the Aboriginal Australians remembered the sky people who came down in glowing craft to teach and then vanished. These are not gentle bedtime fables. They are stories soaked in awe and fear, in survival and reverence. They speak of catastrophes that rewrote the world, of knowledge delivered and then lost, of a golden age remembered only through dream and symbol. Again and again, they return to the same images: a great destruction, a guiding presence, a fall from something higher. Skeptics will say these are coincidences, that flood myths are merely metaphors for seasonal rains or the deep fears of early agricultural societies, that tales of fire from the sky are dramatized memories of meteors, and gods descending in chariots are just the sun, anthropomorphized. And perhaps they are. But the human brain doesn't spin coincidence into myth with such precision unless something rooted it there first. Myths are not made in a vacuum. They are formed where memory fails but refuses to die. What if, instead of seeing myth as fiction, we viewed it as a refracted truth, distorted through time, culture, and language, but anchored in something that once was real? Not literal in every detail, but not imaginary either. What if these flood stories, found from the Arctic to the Amazon, were inherited memories of a global catastrophe, something witnessed, endured, and passed on not through technology, but through narrative? What if the fire that fell from the sky was not lightning, but the last trace of a falling civilization? Consider the great basalt ruins of Nan Madol in Micronesia. Megalithic stones stacked like Lego bricks in the middle of the ocean, with no clear origin and no written explanation. The people say they were placed there by magic, or by those who could command the stones to float. On the other side of the planet, the Tiwanaku site in Bolivia rests 13,000 feet above sea level. Its stones so precisely cut they seem lasered, yet it's older than the Incas, and possibly older than written time itself. Its mythology speaks of gods from the heavens descending to shape the world. Again and again, in places too far apart to have copied each other, the myths describe a similar arc, a time before, a time of light and knowledge, often guided by beings of great power or wisdom, sometimes gods, sometimes star people, sometimes giants. Then a fall, a flood, fire, war, silence, and then a restart, a simpler life, but always with the stories carried forward. These myths are not just folklore, they are structured, generational knowledge. They were remembered not for entertainment, but survival, preserved in chants, ceremonies, and riddles because they mattered. They warned, they explained, and pliam. Perhaps they mourned, and in some cases, they remembered things no one should remember. Take the Dogon people of Mali. Long before modern astronomy, they told of a star called Sirius B, a white dwarf companion to the bright Sirius star. They described its orbital period and density with eerie accuracy, despite the fact it's invisible to the naked eye and was only confirmed by telescopes in the 20th century. They say the knowledge was given to them by Namo, amphibious beings who came from the sky, or the ancient Vedas of India, which describe flying crafts called vimanas, capable of great speeds, vertical lift, and devastating weaponry. The texts even include schematics, propulsion methods, and aerial battles fought in the sky. Scholars call it allegory. Engineers read it and wonder how an allegory describes aerodynamics and mercury propulsion. The truth may be stranger than fiction, but myths have always stood in the space between. Not quite history, not quite fantasy. They are the fossilized bones of memory, warped by time but resistant to decay. They adapt, they evolve, but they don't die. And if enough cultures tell the same story with the same elements, the same fears, the same awe, it begins to resemble a signal, one distorted by noise and repetition, but still pulsing beneath the surface. Even Plato, father of Western philosophy, spoke of Atlantis not as a metaphor but a memory, passed to him through Solon, passed to Solon through the Egyptian priests, who claimed it was real, a mighty civilization destroyed by flood and fire nearly 9,000 years before their own time. A place that fell not because it was mythic, but because it was human. It had pride, power, and it lost its way. When every culture dreams the same dream, it's worth asking if someone once lived it. Maybe long before the pyramids rose, before the ice last receded, there was a people who built high and reached far, who explored the stars or summoned energy from stone, who seeded their knowledge in symbols, stories, and stars, not because they hoped we'd understand it all, but because they feared we might forget. And maybe we did. Maybe we forgot so thoroughly that we named their memories myths and called the ruins coincidence. But maybe we also remembered just enough to wonder, and that wondering the part of us that sees a flood story and doesn't ask why again, but what happened. That may be the first step in waking up the oldest memory we have, the memory before history, the memory before the fall. We think of history as a line, a slow, steady climb from stone tools to stars. But what if it isn't a line at all? What if it's a spiral, and we are not at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in the middle? What if there was once a world before ours, a civilization that rose high, perhaps higher than we have yet gone, and then vanished? Not in myth, not in metaphor, but in reality. Lost not to imagination, but to time, flood, fire, and forgetting. The ground beneath our feet holds more than bones and pottery. It holds layers of silence, evidence buried so deep that it no longer fits inside the timeline we've drawn. Structures that shouldn't exist, maps older than the ice, technologies that appear where they shouldn't, used by people who, according to textbooks, couldn't have made them. Over and over, we find ruins with no clear origin sites, So old their builders are long erased, their names forgotten, their stories folded into legend. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe rises from the earth like the memory of a dream. Massive stone circles, carved with strange animals and precise patterns, dating back to over 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture, cities, or writing. Yet someone built it, with effort, with vision, with skill that shouldn't have existed. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and yet it was carefully buried, not destroyed, as if the builders knew something was coming, as if they wanted it to be found again. Far to the west, in the depths of the Atlantic, rumors swirl around the submerged stones near Bimini, blocks that seem arranged, not scattered, lines that look like roads. Sonar scans off the coast of India reveal underwater structures near Dwarka, temples, streets, walls, all swallowed by the sea. And in the highlands of South America, the stones of Puma Punku lie strewn like the shattered remnants of a forgotten code, carved with machine-like precision, interlocking like puzzles, but without mortar, as if they were once part of a greater machine, not merely a temple. These are not isolated anomalies. They are fragments of a world we no longer understand, a world that may have once stretched across the globe not as a single empire, but as a shared knowledge, passed through the stars, along the currents, and written in stone. A civilization that perhaps knew how to shape energy without wires, build without cranes, and align their monuments not to whims, but to the stars. If such a civilization existed, where did it go? The answer may lie in the layers of earth that record not just time, but trauma. Around 12,800 years ago, the world changed. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to ice after a warming period, slammed the planet into a deep freeze. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. The meltwater pulse was rapid and violent. Ocean levels surged, climate flipped, vast forests burned. A cometary impact or airburst may have struck the North American ice sheets, vaporizing ice, igniting skies, and sending shockwaves through global weather systems. It was not a gentle age. It was the kind of event that ends civilizations. If there was a people alive, then building, thriving, dreaming, they would have been swept away, their cities drowned, their machines torn apart, their libraries turned to ash, and their survivors, if any remained, would not have had the means to rebuild what was lost. They would have returned to the fire, to the forest, to survival, and they would have told stories, stories of a world before, stories of gods and flying cities, stories that one day someone might mistake for myth. Today, we look at the ancient past with certainty. We draw lines. We say, this is when civilization began. This is when we built cities. This is when we first wrote things down. But those lines are drawn with incomplete ink. They ignore the outliers. They skip over the sites that don't fit, the artifacts that are too advanced, too old, or too strange to make sense. The spheres found deep in mines, the maps that show Antarctica without ice, the tales of civilizations from South America to Mesopotamia that speak of a time when men lived with gods and the sky was filled with fire. What if the gods were engineers? What if the temples were machines? What if the pyramids are not tombs at all, but remnants of an older science, one that used vibration, magnetism, and energy in ways we've only begun to rediscover? Modern science is slowly catching up to some of these ideas. Studies into lost Ice Age cultures, the precision of megalithic alignments, and the sudden appearance of agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy all around the same time suggest a spark, a seed planted by someone or something that came before. Not aliens, not magic, but humans, a version of us, one that lived, learned, and was lost. And if they existed, if the myths are memories and the ruins are real, then we are not the first rise of intelligence on this planet. We are the next, a new layer in the spiral. And somewhere deep in our stories, in the symbols we dream and the patterns we carve into stone, their fingerprints remain. Perhaps we are not building something new. Perhaps we are remembering. The ocean holds its breath. Beneath the surface, beneath the waves and silt and time, stories sleep in silence. Not stories written in books, but stories etched into the seabed, broken columns, drowned temples, scattered cities whose names have faded, if they were ever spoken aloud at all. And yet their memory endures, not through archaeology, but through myth, through whispers, through legends that travel like drifting embers from distant shores. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, names that feel ancient even when first heard, names that stretch beyond language, past history, into something older and more uncertain. We are taught to see them as allegories, fabrications meant to carry moral lessons or entertain curious minds. But the persistence of these lost lands in human culture across continents, languages, and millennia suggests they are not simply the inventions of storytellers. Instead, they may be cultural scars, global memories of a time when the sea rose and swallowed something we were never meant to forget. Plato wrote of Atlantis not as fantasy, but as a true account passed down through Egyptian priests to the Greek statesman Solon, a mighty civilization, advanced in knowledge and power, but undone by its own arrogance. He described its destruction as sudden earthquakes, floods, and in a single day and night, it was gone, buried beneath the sea. For centuries, the story was dismissed as metaphor, yet the detail, the scale, and the solemn tone suggest Plato was not merely spinning a parable. He was preserving something, repeating what others had already carried across generations, a fading memory of a world that once was. Thousands of miles away, in the Pacific, another legend stirs. The lost continent of Mu, first spoken of in 19th century texts, but echoing older Polynesian and Southeast Asian traditions. A sunken land, once vast and inhabited by a people of great wisdom, now erased by ocean and time. In temple carvings and oral chants from the Pacific Islands to the coasts of Central America, fragments of this memory remain tales of a homeland swallowed by the sea, of travelers who fled across the water, bringing knowledge to new shores. Then there is Lemuria, a name born from 19th century science, when geologists and biologists sought an explanation for similar species found on far-flung lands. Though the original theory was discarded with the rise of plate tectonics, the name survived, and more importantly, the myth deepened. In Tamil traditions of southern India, the sunken land of Kumari Kandam is described as a cradle of civilization, a continent where poetry, mathematics, and divine knowledge thrived before it was taken by the waves. And in Madagascar, legends speak of a sunken realm to the east, a land where the ancestors came from, long before history began. Each of these names, Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, is tied to a different ocean, a different culture, a different tradition, and yet their stories are eerily similar. A great land, a flourishing civilization, a fall, a flood, a disappearance. What if they are not separate events, but the same trauma, remembered differently, a single catastrophic loss, seen from different shores, each culture interpreting what remained through its own lens, language, and symbol? The sea level rise at the end of the last ice age was not gentle. Over the span of a few thousand years, the oceans rose more than 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished. Continental shelves became sea floors. What had once been lush plains and river valleys turned to saltwater graves. If a civilization had grown in these fertile lowlands as ours has, it would have been obliterated, not just by water, but by the violence of change, by the earthquakes, the floods, the chaos that comes when worlds end. We have found hints. Submerged cities off the coast of India near Dwarka, where ancient walls lie beneath the tide. The Yonaguni Monument near Japan, with its sharp angles and stone platforms descending into the deep. Underwater ruins near Cuba, where sonar scans reveal geometric patterns on the seafloor. Each of these sites invites debate, uncertainty, and caution, but they all whisper the same possibility that not all human history lies on dry land. Perhaps the memory of these sunken realms was not meant to be preserved through stone alone. Perhaps it survived instead in story, stories that turned fact into legend and memory into myth. As survivors moved inland, their tales changed. Their cities became sacred lands, their leaders became gods, their technologies became magic. The rising of the sea became divine punishment, and over time, the truth drowned beneath metaphor. But even in metaphor, something remains. The Polynesians, masters of the ocean, sing of Hawaii, a homeland now lost beneath the waves. The Maya speak of the first sun, a world destroyed by flood. The Egyptians told of Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked among men before chaos swallowed order. And in nearly every one of these stories, the fall is not gradual. It is sudden, violent, a reckoning. Some believe that Atlantis was real, but not in the Atlantic, that it was Antarctica before the ice, or the Caribbean before the rise, that Mu and Lemuria were not single continents, but networks of island cultures linked by star maps and ocean currents, that what we remember as one city may have been many, a global civilization, not centralized like ours, but spread resilient, expansive, and ultimately vulnerable. If this civilization once existed, it was not primitive. The myths speak of precise astronomy, vast architecture, and harmony with the forces of nature. Perhaps they used the Earth's energy in ways we've forgotten. Perhaps they mapped the skies not for curiosity, but for survival. And perhaps their fall was not just a tragedy, but a warning carved into story so that one day, when the world rose again, we might listen. Today, we stand atop our own achievements, watching the seas rise and the weather turn strange. We build higher, dig deeper, and imagine ourselves as the first. But beneath us lie the ruins of something older, and around us the myths persist. Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria. Maybe they are not just stories of what was lost. Maybe they are reminders that we are not the beginning, that we are not immune, that beneath the calm of the sea the past still waits. Across the ancient world, the sky has always been more than empty space. It has been a place of origin, of mystery, of descent. From mountain peaks to open deserts, humans have looked upward and seen not just stars, but stories, not just light, but presence. In almost every culture, there are tales of gods who came from above, not born of the earth, but arriving through it. Shining figures, cloaked in fire or thunder, descending on beams of light, wheels of flame, or flying chariots. Sometimes they came to teach, sometimes to rule, sometimes to destroy. In the texts of Sumer, the Anunnaki arrived from the heavens to shape the fate of man. They did not emerge from trees or rivers, but descended, fully formed and clothed in authority. They brought with them knowledge of kingship, measurement, mining, and war. They moved between heaven and earth as if it were a simple crossing. They were not metaphor. They were described with structure, hierarchy, and power. In India's ancient epics, the sky is alive with battle. The Mahabharata and Ramayana speak of Vimanas, flying machines made of shining metal, capable of terrible speed and immense power. These were not poetic metaphors. They were described with mechanical specificity. The epics speak of propulsion systems, of vertical ascent, of weapons that resemble modern radiation. They speak of aerial wars fought above cities, of engines that roared like thunder and fire that could melt stone. The gods rode these ships like kings on thrones, and their wars shaped the earth. To the Norse, the gods crossed the Bifrost, a burning bridge between worlds, shimmering like a cosmic artery. In the Americas, the Maya told of sky beings who came in floating cities. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was a teacher who descended from the stars and promised to return the same way. In Dogon tradition, the Nomo came from Sirius, a star invisible to the naked eye, yet somehow known with uncanny accuracy. The Zulu speak of sky gods who seeded humanity with purpose, then left, promising to come back when the stars were right. These are not isolated fragments. They are part of a larger pattern, a shared memory dressed in local color. The beings are different, but the entrance is the same, always from above, always with light, sound, and transformation. These gods did not crawl from caves or rise from oceans. They came from the stars. They arrived with tools, machines, languages, and laws. They brought gifts, but also fear. In many myths, the gods were as terrifying as they were awe-inspiring, punishing, testing, demanding. They were not always benevolent, but they were always powerful. Modern interpretations often try to soften these stories into symbolism. Fire from the sky becomes thunder. Chariots become shooting stars. But there's a growing voice, quiet, patient, and increasingly heard that asks, what if these stories aren't symbolic at all? What if our ancestors described what they saw as best they could, using the only language they had? What if the gods of fire and sky were real, not supernatural, but technological? It's not so far-fetched. Imagine a culture with no electricity, no concept of engines, no word for machine, witnessing a craft descending from the clouds, glowing, humming, altering gravity itself. How would they describe it? Not with schematics, but with reverence. Not as science, but as divinity. The roar of turbines becomes thunder. The glow of plasma becomes holy light. The occupants become gods. In Ezekiel's vision, a great chariot descends from the sky, wheels within wheels, burning like molten metal. Creatures with faces of lions and eagles emerge, accompanied by thunder and lightning. For centuries, theologians have tried to decode the symbolism, but seen through a different lens. It resembles a machine structured, powered, designed, not dreamed, but witnessed. We are conditioned to see the ancient past as simple, to believe that we are the first to touch the sky. But what if we are only the latest to interpret it differently? The gods of old may not have been magical. They may have been explorers, scientists, emissaries, or remnants of a civilization that survived something we forgot. Ancient astronaut theory is often dismissed as fringe, but it doesn't demand blind belief. It only asks a question. Why do so many early cultures describe the same kind of encounter in places that had no contact with each other? Why does the language of myth so often mirror the language of machinery? Why do the gods always come from above, never below? It's possible, of course, that humans simply look to the sky and imagine their creators there, that the stars inspired stories, not memories, but the consistency, the detail, the fear, and the fascination suggest more. These myths carry weight because they were remembered with purpose. They were passed down with ceremony, encoded in temples, stone, and song. Even today, our most advanced technologies are described in metaphors. Rockets are dragons, satellites are eyes, spacecraft are birds or arrows. The future is wrapped in language from the past. So imagine the reverse. Imagine the past wrapped in the language of gods, when perhaps it was simply the future, arriving early. What if the gods of fire and sky were not myths, but messengers, not divine, but distant? And what if they left behind more than stories? What if they left behind seeds? Seeds of knowledge, seeds of fear, seeds of longing. The kind of longing that still makes us look up at night and wonder not just what's out there, but who once came down. High above the plains of Shinar, they say a tower once rose, a structure so tall, so vast, it brushed the very breath of the heavens. Built by hands working in unison, guided by a single purpose. It was meant to reach the sky, not as a metaphor, but as a destination. The Tower of Babel is remembered today as a cautionary tale of pride, of ambition, of divine punishment. But what if it's more than a fable? What if, hidden beneath the symbolism, is the echo of something real? An ancient memory of a structure that defied gravity, a machine of stone and fire built not just to touch the stars, but to join them. The book of Genesis describes it simply: "Come, let us build ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens." And in response, the divine looks down, not in admiration, but concern. If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. So the languages are confused, the people scattered, and the project, whatever it was, is lost. But it's that line that lingers. Nothing they plan will be impossible for them. It doesn't read like the punishment of arrogance. It reads like the intervention of fear. All across the ancient world, myths speak of sky-reaching structures. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, tiered and ascending, were said to be points of connection between gods and mortals. In Egypt, the pyramids were not tombs to begin with, but energy centers, beacons aligned with the stars. In the Americas, stepped pyramids point upward, their stairways guiding souls toward the celestial. And in nearly every case, these structures are tied not just to worship, but to movement, to communication, to transformation, to flight. What if the Tower of Babel was not just a building, but a technology, a platform, a launch site, a station for reaching beyond the sky? To ancient eyes, the mechanics of such a place would be indistinguishable from divine magic. Fire pouring from engines, thunder beneath the earth, a pillar rising beyond the clouds. If such a feat had ever been attempted or completed, it would have been remembered in awe, in reverence, and eventually in confusion. The scattering of languages, too, may hold deeper meaning. Linguists trace the origin of language divergence to deep prehistory, but the idea of a single unifying tongue, lost suddenly, is striking. Could it hint at a time when human culture was unified not globally, perhaps, but widely enough to share common goals, common understanding, and perhaps common technologies? If that unity broke, whether by catastrophe or design, the resulting confusion would not just be linguistic. It would be technological amnesia, a severing of the thread that once connected the earth to the sky. Around the world, we find remnants of enormous construction blocks weighing hundreds of tons, moved with methods we still don't fully understand. We find alignments with stars, solstices, and celestial poles, suggesting knowledge of astronomy far beyond what we expect from early societies. And in some cases, we find what seem to be the skeletons of machines, vitrified stone, magnetically charged chambers, and acoustic properties embedded in architecture, not for sound, but for resonance. These are not accidents. They are signatures, traces of an intelligence that didn't just build up, but outward and upward. An intelligence that understood the relationship between the earth and the stars as more than symbolic. To them, the sky wasn't an unreachable ceiling. It was a roadmap. Even today, the launch of a rocket mirrors the myths of old: the flame, the roar, the pillar of smoke, the rise, and then silence, a machine leaving behind the world, aiming for orbit. To ancient people, it would have looked like the heavens opening, and the ones who returned, if any ever did, would be remembered not as engineers, but as gods. If the Tower of Babel was an attempt to return to the stars, perhaps it wasn't the first. Perhaps it was the last attempt in a long chain of remembering, the final echo of a time when people still had fragments of the knowledge once used by a greater civilization now lost, scattered like the languages themselves. The builders may have believed they were reclaiming something that had been taken, rebuilding, not inventing. And perhaps they came close enough to draw attention. The myth says the divine descended to see what was being built, not to celebrate it, but to stop it, not because it offended, but because it threatened. That kind of reaction speaks to something more tangible than a tall tower. It suggests fear, urgency, a belief that if left unchecked, the human species might recover what had been lost too soon. So, the memory was fractured, the languages turned, the tower fell, but the story endured. It endured because something extraordinary happened, and though the structure itself may be buried, the myth is still climbing. It climbs through every culture that dreams of the stars, through every monument aligned to Orion or Sirius, through every carving of winged beings and staircases into the sky, through every child who stares upward and wonders if we were always meant to return. Maybe the Tower of Babel wasn't a punishment, but a pause, a reset, a line drawn in the dust to slow us down until we could carry the knowledge more wisely. Or maybe it was a warning, one we only now begin to decode, as our rockets once again breach the sky and our machines touch the edge of space. We build towers again, not from brick, but from silicon and flame. And this time, the languages are converging, not into one, but into many voices speaking together across wires and waves. The scattering is reversing. Slowly, quietly, we are climbing again, and the stars are still waiting. Across jungles, deserts, and mountains, beneath layers of soil and centuries, the same shapes appear, again and again. Spirals, triangles, circles drawn with uncanny precision. Stone temples, pyramids, and megalithic alignments, built in places separated by vast oceans and unknown to each other, or so we've long believed. From Giza to Teotihuacan, from Angkor Wat to Stonehenge, geometry binds these places together like a thread through time. The same angles, the same proportions, the same alignment with stars and solstices. Too much alike to be coincidence, too deliberate to be dismissed. Sacred geometry, some call it a language of form, carried like a quiet whisper from one culture to another, as though it had never truly been forgotten. The number 72 appears in ancient texts and temple measurements alike, echoing the precession of the equinoxes, a celestial wobble of the earth so subtle it takes over 25,000 years to complete a single cycle. But this knowledge, the mathematics of it, the patience to chart it, should have been beyond the reach of early civilizations, if we follow the timelines written in textbooks, and yet it surfaces across myth and stone alike, encoded into temples that have stood for millennia. At Angkor Wat, the number of towers and steps align with celestial ages. At Giza, the layout of the pyramids mirrors the stars of Orion's belt, tilted just as they appear in the sky. The ratios of their dimensions echo the golden mean. Phi 1.618, found not just in nature, but in the design of cathedrals, mandalas, and nautilus shells. How did they know? Modern engineers study these sites with lasers and satellites, finding precision that stuns them. Massive stones cut and placed with margins of error, less than a millimeter. Entire complexes aligned not only to the rising and setting sun, but to stars whose positions would only be correct for a narrow window in deep antiquity. The Sphinx stares directly east, aligned with the rising sun on the equinox. But even more curiously, it aligns with the constellation Leo, 12,000 years. What message were they encoding, if not time itself? We tend to separate the sacred from the scientific, the mystical from the mathematical. But to ancient builders, they were likely the same thing. Geometry was not abstract. It was a language through which the divine revealed itself. The triangle was not just a shape, but a symbol of harmony between spirit, mind, and matter. The circle, infinite and complete, mirrored the sky, and the square rooted them to the earth. In these patterns, they found order. In order, they found meaning, and meaning was carved into stone. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman are laid with stones that interlock in jagged, zigzagging patterns, earthquake-resistant, complex, and still standing. No mortar, just weight and precision. In Cambodia, the temples of Angkor rise in lotus-like tiers, their spires mimicking the peaks of mythical Mount Meru, the center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. But more than symbolism, their layout forms a mandala of balance-encoded mathematics fused with cosmic lore. Even more strangely, similar geometric motifs are found in places that supposedly had no contact. The stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica mirror the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Mandalas from Tibet resemble crop circle patterns in England. Labyrinths etched into Scandinavian stones match those carved into the floor of Chartres Cathedral in France. The Flower of Life, an ancient geometric figure made of interlocking circles, appears on temple walls in Egypt, in medieval alchemical texts, and in Chinese jade etchings. We call it parallel evolution of thought, independent invention. But what if it's something else? What if these patterns are fragments of a deeper memory, shared and reshared through time, not through culture, but through intuition? What if the human mind, when seeking order in the cosmos, returns again and again to the same forms because they are already written within us? Or, perhaps, because they were once taught to keep us handed down like tools from a forgotten world? There is a theory that the ancients inherited knowledge rather than discovered it, that they remembered how to build, but not why. That sacred geometry, as it appears around the world, is the language of a civilization before our own, one that understood energy, not just through combustion, but through form. Temples were not just monuments, but machines. Stone circles channeled frequencies. Pyramids resonated with the Earth's magnetic field. Ratios were not aesthetic, but functional. Each angle, each measurement tuned like an instrument, designed to harmonize with nature itself. To modern ears, this sounds mystical. But today's science is rediscovering what ancient builders might have already known. Cymatics, the study of how sound shapes matter, shows that frequency creates patterned geometric shapes rising from grains of sand or pools of liquid, forming stars, eyes, and spirals. Quantum mechanics reveals a world of resonance and vibration, where energy is organized not by mass, but by pattern. And even in space, the architecture of galaxies follows fractal geometry, spiraling in golden ratios, echoing the same design principles seen in temples on Earth. It may not be that ancient people were more advanced. It may be that they were more attuned, more patient. They watched the sky not with telescopes, but with reverence. They studied the Earth not to conquer it, but to understand their place within it. And from this harmony came structures that endure not just physically, but symbolically. Because symbols endure longer than stone, perhaps that's why the same shapes keep surfacing, not just in temples, but in dreams, in sacred texts, in the way we design cities, logos, and even digital code. The circle, the triangle, the spiral, patterns written not just into history, but into us, passed forward through architecture, through myth, through the silent language of proportion and line. A message hidden in plain sight, whispering that we are not alone in our search for meaning. We are remembering, and the shapes are how we speak it. They came from the sky. That much is almost always agreed upon. In stories whispered across generations and continents, beings descended from above, not falling, not drifting, but arriving, controlled, deliberate, with thunder, light, and sometimes the shimmer of metal. The memories differ in their names, their symbols, their gods and heroes, but one thing repeats again and again: flight. Not of birds, not of spirits, but of machines. Chariots of fire, ships that hum and hover, thrones that ride beams of light or are pulled by the windless will of something unseen. To the ancients, it must have felt like magic, but to us, Centuries later, it sounds eerily familiar. In India's ancient epics, the sky is alive with movement. The Mahabharata speaks of Vimanas flying chariots that soared across the heavens. Some spun like fire-tipped discs. Others rose vertically, traveling great distances in a matter of moments. They carried warriors, sages, kings. These weren't dreamlike metaphors. They were detailed, with instructions, mechanics, and even battle protocols. They were made of metal. They had compartments. They used fuel liquids, fire, sometimes a kind of solar energy. The descriptions are technical enough to resemble blueprints. In the Ramayana, Rama's Vimana was gifted by the gods, capable of traveling wherever the mind desired. But it was not just transport, it was command. Power that moved not by muscle, but by will and force, and something else entirely. Across the ocean, in the jungles of Mesoamerica, similar echoes rise. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity of the Aztecs and Maya, did not simply walk the earth. He arrived, and later, he departed not by death or fading into myth, but by boarding a celestial raft of fire and light. The Popol Vuh, the Mayan book of creation, describes beings who came from the stars to shape the world. Their tools weren't stone or wood, but things that shimmered. Their movements weren't bounded by rivers or mountains, but spanned the sky. And when their time ended, they did not descend into the underworld. They returned to the heavens as though they had only been visiting. In the Middle East, the skies are also crowded. The book of Ezekiel recounts a vision, a great wheel within a wheel, burning with fire, descending from the sky. Its sound was like rushing waters, its light like molten metal. Beings moved within it, creatures with multiple faces, glowing and alive. Some call it divine. Others read the description and see a vehicle, a craft, a memory so strange that only the language of visions could contain it. The Hebrew term Merkabah refers to a chariot often divine, often radiant, and often flying. These legends weren't written in dialogue with one another. They emerged from isolated cultures, speaking in different tongues, separated by oceans and mountains, and yet they remember the same thing, the same descent, the same machines, the same miracle of flight. Why? Some say it's just a metaphor, that the sky is a natural canvas for divine stories, that the gods had to come from somewhere and the heavens were the most obvious choice. But these weren't just gods floating on clouds. They weren't always spiritual. They were tactile. They had rules. They arrived with noise, sometimes with destruction. In some stories, they even crashed. In the Sanskrit Samarangana Sutradhara, an ancient treatise on engineering, entire sections are devoted to flying machines. It speaks of propulsion, of heat-resistant metals, of aerial maneuvers. It is written not as fiction, but as instruction, though many pages are said to have been lost or deliberately hidden. In Colombia, golden artifacts shaped like tiny aircraft have been discovered, triangular, aerodynamic, with vertical stabilizers and wings that would not belong to birds. In Egypt, carvings in Abydos depict shapes resembling helicopters and futuristic crafts. They are layered, unclear, debated, but still, they linger. Flight is humanity's great dream. And yet, these myths don't dream of flying the way we once did, with feathers, with imitation, with trial and failure. They skip past that. They begin with mastery, with ships that already work, with vehicles already in the air. What kind of memory is that? Perhaps these stories are exaggerations of natural phenomena, ball lightning, comets, meteor showers. But ball lightning does not leave behind blueprints. Comets do not teach architecture. Meteor showers don't descend in spirals and speak in language. These stories are structured, personal, and they come with consequences, sometimes reverence, sometimes war, always awe, and always they leave. That's another pattern. The beings in these vessels rarely stay. They appear, influence, intervene, and vanish, leaving behind artifacts, scars, temples, and myths. And in their absence, the world tries to make sense of them, to preserve them, not as history, but as sacred tale, a flame too bright to look at directly, so it must be retold in riddles. Maybe flight is older than we think. Maybe humans once remembered it, not as fantasy, but as fact. Maybe a civilization came before ours, mastering the sky in ways we are only beginning to replicate. Or perhaps we were visited, watched, taught, nudged by something that understood the cosmos better than we do now. Something that once soared through the skies above deserts and jungles and temples, and whose shadow we still chase in the pages of myth. The sky is silent now, but it wasn't always. The memory lingers, in golden figurines, in crumbling texts, in carvings on stone walls worn smooth by time. We've written our histories in books and data, but they wrote theirs in story and symbol, fragments of awe, passed forward like embers in the dark. And some part of us still remembers, still watches the clouds and the stars, waiting for something to return, or perhaps for something buried deep within us to awaken again. In the oldest myths, the gods did not merely reign from distant skies. They mingled with mortals, walked among them, and sometimes bore children with them. These children were not just symbolic offspring of spirit and soil. They were physical, tangible, beings of dual nature, part human, part something else. Demigods, heroes, sages with wisdom beyond their years and strength that defied explanation. Across civilizations, these stories unfold with striking consistency. The Nephilim of the Hebrew texts, the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, the Naga of India, the sons of the gods and daughters of men, or the other way around. Again and again, ancient traditions whisper of bloodlines touched by the divine, something altered, something preserved. But what if this isn't just metaphor? Modern science is unlocking the code of life itself. A double helix twisting like a spiral staircase, holding instructions that shape everything we are. Hair color, memory, resistance, potential. And deep within our DNA lie sequences whose function remains unknown, ancient, conserved across eons, passed through countless generations. Some call it junk DNA, as if what we don't understand must be meaningless. But others wonder whether this hidden code holds a story far older than anything written in stone or scroll. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens and created mankind to serve them by mixing their essence with that of the earth, clay and blood, flesh and command, not through enchantment, but through deliberate design. The myths say humans were not born naturally, but shaped, adjusted, not wholly divine, not wholly beast, but something in between, hybrid. In Egypt, the pharaohs were said to carry the blood of the gods. Their right to rule came not from conquest, but from lineage. The symbol of the uraeus, the serpent on their brow, was a mark of divine sight, of wisdom encoded within. They were not merely kings, they were vessels of memory. The rituals surrounding their birth and succession were not pageantry. They were attempts to preserve purity, to protect a line believed to trace back to the stars. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was born of a virgin. So was Kukulkan. Their bloodlines carried secrets and prophecies. In India, the Mahabharata speaks of the Pandava brothers fathered by gods, yet walking as men. They were marked by unusual birth, unnatural skill, and destinies shaped by war and cosmic design. In nearly every culture, there are families set apart not just by wealth or status, but by mythic origin. Their traits repeat through generations. Unusual abilities, resistance to disease, heightened perception, longevity. Traits that don't quite fit within the smooth curve of natural evolution. It raises a question that hovers quietly at the edge of belief. Could ancient stories of divine birth be garbled recollections of genetic intervention? not in the cold clinical sense we imagine in sterile labs, but something far older, more advanced, something we would see as magic because we've never encountered it before. Science is beginning to toy with the possibilities. CRISPR allows us to edit genes like text. We've cloned animals, resurrected dormant traits, and inserted foreign DNA into living organisms. If we can do this now, as a fledgling civilization barely past its industrial adolescence, what might an older, more refined intelligence have achieved? And if they did, where would they leave their signature? Not on the surface, which erodes and crumbles, not in books, which burn and decay, but in blood, in the helix, in the coiled script within every cell, carrying echoes of decisions made long ago. There are people today with strands of DNA that don't match any known lineage, small segments that suggest an unknown ancestor, not simply ancient, but anomalous. In Tibet, there are genes that allow survival at high altitude, acquired not from adaptation, but seemingly from an extinct hominin species. In Africa, tribes possess markers that don't trace back to any identified branch of the human family tree. We shrug, call them mysteries, outliers, but what if they are messages? Myths have long spoken of watchers, of caretakers who came down to guide, teach, and sometimes alter. The Book of Enoch tells of angels who descended, taught forbidden knowledge, and bred with humans, producing offspring that were neither here nor there, too large, too bright, too strange. The flood, in many traditions, came not as punishment for sin, but to cleanse the world of these hybrids. Not out of moral outrage, but to reset a balance that had tipped too far. And yet, some bloodlines remained, hidden, protected, revered. Even today, the idea of royal blood lingers, detached from logic, but not from myth. In our stories, we still cling to the idea that someone, somewhere, carries a spark that others do not, that within them lies a memory waiting to awaken. And maybe it's not just fantasy. Maybe deep in the folds of our DNA, something slumbers. Not just information, but intention. A design embedded so long ago we've forgotten it was ever placed there. And perhaps that is why we keep looking to the stars, not just for visitors, but for ancestors, for the origin of that quiet feeling we can't explain, that sense that we are more than a product of Earth's own chaos, that something someone helped shape what we've become. In myth, the gods came down and gifted us fire, language, tools. But the most profound gift may have been genetic, not a change to what we are, but to what we could be, a key turned slightly in the lock of our potential. And maybe, just maybe, the rest is up to us to remember. Beneath layers of moss and silence, in places where the jungle exhales and the desert sighs, the stones remain, stacked with impossible precision, carved with unfathomable skill, balanced in ways that seem to deny gravity itself. They have outlived the civilizations that built them. They have survived earthquakes, floods, conquest, and time. And still, they hold their place, refusing to explain themselves. The deeper we dig, the more we find not the expected signs of primitiveness, but anomalies, evidence of a lost knowledge, a forgotten craftsmanship that eludes even our most advanced technologies. The stones don't just speak. They whisper secrets too strange to be coincidence. In Peru, high in the Andes, the walls of Sacsayhuaman stand like a puzzle solved long ago and never again. Cyclopean blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, are fitted together without mortar, their seams so tight a knife blade can't pass between. They are cut not at right angles, but with complex, interlocking joints, zigzags, and curves that create both stability and fluidity, as if the stone had once been soft clay molded into place. There are no chisel marks, no records of the tools used, no scaffolding, no copper implements that would have bent or shattered against such massive boulders, just the finished product, still standing, daring us to explain it. Elsewhere in Peru, The fortress of Ollantaytambo features stones transported from a quarry miles away, across a river and up a mountain. Modern engineers puzzle over how such feats were even conceivable without cranes, pulleys, or steel. The terrain itself resists the idea. It's as though gravity had once obeyed a different rule, or had been overcome, not with brute force, but with an understanding we no longer possess. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza rises with mathematical precision. Its base is aligned almost perfectly with true north. Its dimensions encode the ratios of the Earth, the Moon, and even pi. Inside, the granite blocks of the King's Chamber weigh up to 70 tons, transported from a quarry 500 miles away. The surfaces are polished, smooth, the angles exact. Engineers today would struggle to replicate such work at that scale with the same precision, even with laser-cutting tools. And yet, it was done over 4,000 years ago according to the conventional timeline with copper chisels and stone hammers. But where are those tools? Archaeological digs turn up pottery, jewelry, and crude implements by the thousands, but not the instruments capable of slicing granite like butter or lifting blocks the size of boxcars. Not the devices that could heat stone to the point of melting, reshaping it, and setting it to cool without fractures. Not the mechanisms that could read the sky and embed its rhythm in architecture with sub-millimeter accuracy. And then there is vitrification. Across Europe and Asia, we find ancient forts with stone walls that have been melted and fused into glass. Scotland, France, Turkey, and Iran sites where something once burned hot enough to liquefy stone without reducing the structure to ash. Theories range from lightning to volcanic heat to firestorms, but none explain the controlled, selective vitrification found at these sites. Natural causes leave chaos. But these walls remain intact, melted but standing, altered but deliberate. Something once knew how to reach those temperatures and apply them with purpose. Even in India, the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro shows signs of an abrupt, unnatural heat event. Skeletons lie in the streets, unburied, as if caught unaware. Certain patches of earth show signs of radiation and vitrified surfaces. It's as if something flashed through a moment of energy or destruction we can't fully name. Some have likened it to the aftermath of a nuclear event, and though that claim is steeped in controversy, the anomalies remain. Across the ocean, at Pumapunku in Bolivia, stone blocks are cut with such precision that they fit together like pieces of a machine, right angles, smooth channels, and boreholes that suggest the use of advanced tools we can't find, and techniques we can't explain. The sandstone and andesite used are among the hardest natural materials, and yet the surfaces show no signs of chipping or carving, just clean, straight lines, as if a blade of light or sound passed through the rock like a whisper. We call them anomalies. We classify them as mysteries, but perhaps they are fragments, vestiges of a knowledge so advanced it no longer fits our expectations of ancient humanity. Not aliens, not magic, but a civilization that once stood higher than we now imagine, then fell, leaving only the shadows of its brilliance embedded in stone. Because stone does not lie. It does not embellish or forget. It simply endures. It carries the fingerprints of those who understood frequency, vibration, and geometry, not as abstract science, but as tools. Some believe sound was once used to levitate, to cut, to shape. The ancient Egyptians spoke of spoken words that could move objects. Tibetan monks still chant in harmonic resonance that causes physical vibration. What if our ancestors knew how to amplify this? Not through electronics, but through understanding the ability to manipulate matter by tuning into its frequency, like finding the note that makes a glass ring. If they knew how to do this, they didn't write it down the way we would today. They embedded it into architecture, into alignments, into proportions. The secrets were not encrypted in code, but in form. You don't need a hard drive when your cathedral is a library, your wall a waveform, your temple a tuning fork. It's possible we're not meant to find the answers with excavation alone. The stones won't yield their truth to drills or debates. but perhaps they will to resonance, to intuition, to remembering. These ancient builders left behind no wires, no circuits, no schematics, just silence. And in that silence, something stirs a memory not of myth, but of capacity, a sense that we've been here before, that we once built with the earth and sky in harmony, not in opposition, and that deep within the stones, waiting patiently, the past still speaks. We just have to learn how to listen. The silence that followed was not ordinary. It was the silence of something vast being undone, not a mere ending, but a forgetting so deep that the world itself seemed to bury the memory. Whatever came before, whatever heights the first civilization may have reached, did not disappear gradually. It vanished, suddenly and completely, leaving only fragments behind. Stone ruins swallowed by jungle, cities beneath the sea, stories carved into the walls of temples or whispered in myths, speaking of floods, fire from the heavens, and a sky that once turned against the earth. The first great collapse may have happened so long ago that time itself struggles to hold on to the details. But across cultures, there is an echo, a shared trauma encoded into myth and scripture. The Bible tells of a flood sent to cleanse a world gone wrong. The Epic of Gilgamesh, older still, recounts a storm so violent it swallowed the land and left only a lone survivor drifting on a boat. In India's Puranas, a similar deluge overtakes the earth, and a divine fish warns Manu to prepare. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulated the world after a flood wiped out the hubris of man. In Mesoamerica, the gods destroy humanity with water, only to try again with fire. In almost every corner of the planet, there is a memory of being nearly erased. One of the most compelling theories points to the Younger Dryas period, an abrupt return to Ice Age conditions around 12,800 years ago. The climate shifted in an instant, animals went extinct, and something massive changed the trajectory of human life. What caused it remains a matter of fierce debate, but a number of researchers believe it wasn't just a climate event. It was a cosmic impact. The theory centers on a fragmented comet or asteroid that may have struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, unleashing firestorms, floods, and a long winter. Nanodiamonds, microspherules, and layers of soot have been found in geological strata from that time, indicators of extreme heat and shock. Melted glass across North America, black mats of carbon-rich soil, and the sudden disappearance of megafauna all point to a cataclysm. Some scientists dismiss it. Others insist it may have wiped out not only species, but entire cultures. If an advanced civilization had existed before, built along coastlines or river deltas as most civilizations do, it would have been vulnerable. A sudden rise in sea level like the one that followed the melting of the ice caps would have drowned cities, erased farmland, and shattered trade routes. Flood myths might not be metaphors. They may be distant, memories of walls of water consuming the known world. And for survivors, it would have felt like the end of everything. A world that had climbed too high, suddenly reset. Other theories speak of fire not from the sky, but from within. Ancient texts hint at wars between gods, waged with weapons so devastating they scorched the earth. The Mahabharata describes an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns, with heat that burned the trees and animals and turned the sand into glass. Some interpret this as poetic exaggeration. Others wonder if it hints at something stranger, an ancient understanding of energy and destruction that mirrors the effects of nuclear detonation. At Mohenjo-Daro, skeletons were found with high radiation levels and signs of extreme trauma. The city itself was abruptly abandoned, the brickwork fused by heat. Whether by cosmic force or internal conflict, something stopped the story, something reset the clock, and what followed was not progress, but survival. Humanity scattered, knowledge fragmented, languages lost their complexity, architecture became simpler, Oral traditions replaced written records. The pyramid builders and stargazers gave way to subsistence farmers and tribal hunters. What had been extraordinary became myth. What had been science became magic. And what had been memory began to blur. The survivors, if there were any, would have been left with pieces, the memory of fire and sky, the cautionary tales of pride and punishment, the reverence for those who came before gods, angels, ancestors who had built the world and then vanished. Over time, their technologies would become relics, their cities ruins, their tools mysteries, and those born into the aftermath would rebuild, but never quite the same. It's tempting to imagine Atlantis in this space, a name given by Plato to a civilization that vanished beneath the sea in a single day and night. He claimed it was real, a warning from history. Critics argue it was allegory, but what if it wasn't? What if Atlantis was only one name for a shared memory, scattered across cultures with different masks? Mu, Lemuria, Atla, all telling the same tale through different voices. A story of rise and fall, of brilliance undone by arrogance or fate. Catastrophe has always been a part of life on Earth. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, plagues, solar flares. But there's a difference between disaster and reset, between damage and erasure. The first collapse, whatever caused it, didn't just hurt, it buried. And in doing so, it left the survivors not just in ruin, but in amnesia. Even now, as we look back through layers of soil and story, we see only glimpses, structures too complex to explain, myths too universal to ignore, patterns that don't quite fit the linear path we've been taught, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that somehow lock together. The further back we look, the more it seems that history may not be a line, but a cycle of ascent, collapse, and memory. Perhaps what we call progress is simply the long journey back to what we once were. Perhaps every invention, every rediscovery, is the echo of something forgotten. And perhaps beneath the oceans, or beneath our feet, the remnants of that first age still wait, silent, patient, reminding us that forgetting is not the same as erasing, and that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, will always find their way to the surface. When the Great Collapse came, whether by fire, flood, or sky, the world didn't end completely. It fractured. The light dimmed, but it didn't vanish. Scattered among the shattered mountains, the drowned coastlines, and the burned-out ruins, a few survived. Not entire civilizations, perhaps, but small clusters of people clinging to the edges of what had once been vast and ordered. Farmers turned foragers, builders turned wanderers, and among them, somewhere, were those who remembered. They didn't remember everything. How could they? The tools were gone, the cities swallowed, the sky no longer spoke. But the memory lived on in shapes, in stories, in rhythms that beat just beneath language. They remembered the stars and how to find direction in their patterns. They remembered the floods and the warning signs in the sky. They remembered the gods, not as distant deities, but as presences that once walked beside them. And most of all, they remembered that they came from something greater, a world more connected, more intelligent, more whole. But without paper or stone to write it on, how do you pass down a memory meant to last thousands of years? You tell it, around fires, under open skies, in caves and shelters carved into the rock. The stories began, not as data, not as diagrams, but as songs, as poems, as parables. Because facts can be forgotten, but stories take root. They carry emotion. They move with the voice. They adapt, but they endure. In every culture, the storytellers rose not to entertain, but to protect the thread. They became the memory keepers, the oral architects of what had been. And over time, the memories blurred into myth. But that was the point. If you want knowledge to survive war, weather, and forgetting, You bury it in metaphor. You dress it in symbols and disguise it as children's tales. A flood becomes punishment for pride. A lost city becomes a moral warning. A sky chariot becomes a vision of the gods. But inside the layers, the structure remains. A story told in rhythm and image can travel through millennia, slipping past fire and flood, because it doesn't look like a map. It looks like magic. The Hopi peoples speak of past worlds destroyed, and a handful of survivors guided to safety underground before re-emerging to start again. In Australia, the Aboriginal Dreamtime carries echoes of a time before time, where beings of great power shaped the land and sky and left instructions embedded in story and song. In Africa, the Dogon people tell of star systems invisible to the naked eye and describe the motion of Sirius B knowledge that predates modern astronomy by centuries. How? Maybe because someone once told them. Maybe because someone who survived the collapse passed it on in a way that didn't look like knowledge to outsiders. It looked like ritual, like dance, like myth. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis guarded stories not just of gods, but of cycles, ages that rose and fell, civilizations lost to fire and water, with knowledge preserved in temple walls and sacred geometry. Plato spoke of Solon, who heard from Egyptian priests that mankind had forgotten everything not once, but many times, that the earth is old, and civilizations rise like breath, only to be exhaled into silence again. In India, yogic traditions speak of vast cycles of time, yugas, where human consciousness and knowledge wax and wane. The knowledge is never fully lost, only hidden, encoded in symbols, locked within practices, preserved through sacred transmission. Sometimes, the survivors didn't tell the story openly at all. They built it, they etched it into stone. They aligned temples to the stars, not to worship, but to record, not to pray, but to anchor memory. A pyramid isn't just a tomb, it's a clock, a compass, a statement. The great cathedrals of Europe hold ratios matching those of older temples in Egypt and Greece. Their stained glass is more than decoration. It's light turned into narrative. The Rosicrucians, the alchemists, the keepers of esoteric schools may have been less inventors than inheritors. And sometimes, the knowledge survived not in the public eye, but in secret. Whispers of mystery schools passed from teacher to student, often in shadows, sometimes in exile. The Eleusinian mysteries, the druids of the ancient isles, the initiates of Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus, were they inventing new truths or tending an older fire? Perhaps what they preserved wasn't a doctrine, but a frequency, a way of thinking, of tuning the mind to remember things the body has long forgotten. Even language, in its oldest forms, may have carried codes. Sanskrit, Hebrew, Egyptian, hieroglyphs, alphabets, built on sound and number, on resonance as much as meaning. To speak them was to activate something. To write them was to mirror the world, not just describe it. The survivors may have known that writing is not just about preservation, but transformation. The right symbols, in the right order, become a spell, one that binds knowledge to time. And so, the past became layered, the surface story simple, moral, digestible, but underneath, another layer, and another, like an onion or a labyrinth. Only those who sought the center would find it, and only those who truly listened would hear what had been carried all this way, not as history, but as seed. Because that's what survivors do. They don't just rebuild the world, they plant the next one. And maybe that's what these myths really are. Not memories of what was, but instructions for what could be. Not ruins, but blueprints. Warnings wrapped in wonder. Maps disguised as magic. Because the fire may come again. The flood may rise. The sky may fall. And when it does, the story will be waiting, hidden in plain sight, ready to be remembered. In the twilight place between memory and myth, there are figures who do not quite fit the mold of gods, nor that of men. They arrive not from within the stories, but from somewhere beyond them, already radiant, already robed in knowledge. And though we have come to call them deities, their actions are often curiously human. They teach, they build, they organize. They descend from the sky and vanish without dying. They promise return. And they leave behind not just belief, but systems writing, calendars, architecture, agriculture, and laws. Across cultures and continents, they appear with striking similarity, wearing different names, but always walking the same liminal line. Perhaps they were not born of the imagination, but remembered through the distortion of time. The Anunnaki of Mesopotamia are among the oldest of these, described not as incorporeal spirits, but as flesh and blood beings who came from the heavens to shape the fate of Earth. They are often depicted in reliefs, with tools, wrist devices, and bags that resemble the satchels carried by deities from Sumer to Mesoamerica. The texts do not describe them as ethereal forces of nature. They are rulers, administrators, sometimes even rivals among themselves. They assign territories, designate duties, instruct in metallurgy, agriculture, and astronomy. Enki, wise and rebellious, teaches humanity forbidden knowledge. Enlil enforces order and wipes out life when it disobeys. Their stories are layered in allegory, yes, but they also read like political drama, like the recollections of a time when knowledge was gifted and guarded. In the lands across the ocean, among the pyramids of Mesoamerica, another figure descends. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, part bird, part snake, part man. He brings maize to the people, introduces calendars and language, and opposes blood sacrifice. He is not born of the earth, but arrives from the east, across the sea, and eventually leaves in a similar fashion, promising to return. In Aztec codices and Mayan carvings, he is shown bearded, clothed in strange garments, his eyes wise and sorrowful. Some later accounts describe him as tall, pale-skinned, unlike the people he governed. Was this a colonial projection, or the echo of something older, a memory preserved imperfectly through the turning of generations? The myths don't agree on every detail, but they all share one thing: the arrival of a teacher, a civilizer, someone who did not rise from within the society but entered it suddenly, bearing the weight of forgotten worlds. And when the time came, they departed, not in death, but in disappearance, into the mountains, the sea, the sky, always with the sense that their time had merely paused, not ended. In ancient Egypt, Thoth is remembered as the architect of writing, the measurer of time, and the keeper of sacred knowledge. Often shown with the head of an ibis or a baboon, his imagery evokes strangeness, yes, but his essence is order. He is not only a god, but a recorder, a master of geometry and proportion. The Greeks would later merge him with Hermes and imagine him as Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, father of alchemy and initiator of mystery schools. But in the Egyptian records, Thoth is not a distant deity. He interacts directly with kings, advises Isis and Osiris, and holds the scales upon which the soul is weighed. He is present, engaged, almost administrative in his divine work. It's a pattern that repeats again and again. In India, the god Vishwakarma is said to have constructed the ancient cities of the gods, wielding tools of precision that echo the karma, lasers, and 3D modeling of today. In Greece, Prometheus steals fire, not just flame, but intellect, innovation, and gives it to humanity at great personal cost. In the Norse tales, Odin does not create the world from nothing, but sacrifices himself to gain knowledge. These are not the distant creators of monotheistic religions. These are beings who intervene, who sculpt, who seem almost like visitors from an age beyond our own, mistaken for gods by those left in awe. If such figures were real, if they were part of a forgotten civilization or something else entirely, How would memory preserve them across the ages? With reverence, with exaggeration, with symbols, animal masks, and mythic tales. We would not remember their tools, but we'd recall the light that followed them. We'd remember the shock of their arrival, the calm of their voice, the sense that they were older than time and wiser than kings. Over centuries, the precision of fact would soften into the poetry of worship. Their names would become mantras. Their actions would become miracles. Even their disappearances would be magnified into mystery. Because beings like these do not die in stories. They ascend, or vanish, or sail west beyond the sunset. They are not mourned, they are awaited. What if the gods were never meant to be worshipped, but remembered, not as creators of the universe, but as bearers of light in a world that had forgotten how to see? What if their temples were schools, their myths textbooks, their rituals reenactments of something once lived and now longed for? The further back we look, the more these figures stand apart. They do not belong to the same mythic landscape as dragons, monsters, or tricksters. They are outliers, wise, measured, strangely consistent across geographies that had no contact, no shared trade, no mutual language. Yet their names rhyme in concept. Their teachings echo. Their exits are always marked with sorrow and hope. Some may call it coincidence, but coincidence doesn't build pyramids in parallel. It doesn't craft myths of identical beings arriving from the sky on every continent. It doesn't explain why these deities so often bring not chaos, but structure, not magic, but mathematics. Perhaps they were remnants of a lost civilization, sent out to plant the seeds of order before the flood. Or maybe they were something else, travelers from afar, ancient custodians, beings who saw a species in darkness and chose to strike a match. What matters is not how they arrived, but that we still speak their names, still tell their stories, still wait, in some quiet place, for them to return. Not as gods, but as memory come alive again. In the stillness of a desert night, before cities cloaked the sky in orange haze, the stars once spoke more clearly. They pulsed and shimmered like thoughts waiting to be remembered, laid out in great arcs above the heads of ancient watchers. Without telescopes or satellites, without glass lenses or digital maps, they charted the heavens with uncanny precision. They tracked the slow tilt of Earth's axis, a motion so gradual it takes nearly 26,000 years to complete a single cycle. They built stone calendars that aligned with solstices and equinoxes and sacred points in the sky, knowing exactly when a star would rise or fall, centuries into the future. They named celestial bodies invisible to the naked eye, and when we ask how they did this, the answer echoes back in silence, carved in stone, whispered in song, encoded in myth. The Dogon people of Mali, tucked into sandstone cliffs and speaking an ancient dialect, told French anthropologists in the 1,930 seconds about a star companion to Sirius, the brightest star in our sky. They knew it was small, dense, and incredibly heavy, describing it as the smallest and heaviest of all stars. They called it Potolo, the seed star, and they said it revolved around Sirius every 50 years. When Western astronomers confirmed the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf, invisible without advanced telescopes, the scientific world staggered. How had the Dogon known? The official explanation dismissed it as coincidence or contamination. Perhaps they'd picked up scraps of knowledge from explorers or missionaries, but the Dogon insisted the knowledge had been with them for generations. Taught, they said, by beings who came from the stars. In Egypt, the stars were not simply lights, but gods. Osiris lived in Orion. Isis was bound to Sirius. The entire mythos of death and rebirth, of cosmic order, was mirrored in the movement of these stars. The pyramids of Giza align not only with the cardinal points of Earth, but with the belt of Orion at the time of their construction. Shafts within the Great Pyramid point directly to stars associated with divine figures, as if the builders were mapping a gateway not just for the soul, but for something more precise, something technological, encoded in symbolism. The precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon resulting from the Earth's slow axial wobble, causes the position of the sunrise at the spring equinox to drift backward through the zodiac over thousands of years. It's a complex astronomical observation, only detectable through long-term, consistent tracking. And yet, ancient cultures not only recognized it, they embedded it into myth. The Vedic texts of India speak of great ages, yugas, that unfold over tens of thousands of years. Plato described time in grand cycles and spoke of a great year. The Sphinx, eroded and enigmatic, gazes east toward the equinox sunrise. Once, long ago, it would have greeted the constellation Leo rising in the dawn, its own shape reflected in the stars. How did they know? How did they build observatories of stone in Britain, in Cambodia, in the Andes, that could predict eclipses and solstices and the lunar standstill? Stonehenge marks the solstices with eerie precision. Angkor Wat, from above, mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared in 10,500 BCE, an alignment that serves no purpose unless it was meant to encode memory. At Chichen Itza, a shadow serpent slithers down the steps of the temple on equinox days, as if the sun itself were reminding the people of some grand pattern they must not forget. And it wasn't just the stars. The ancient Polynesians navigated thousands of miles across open ocean, using only the sky, waves, and wind. They knew where islands would rise over the horizon days before they arrived. They passed the knowledge in chants and songs, oral maps carried in memory, precise enough to guide generations. Was it trial and error? Purely human brilliance spread over time? Perhaps. But what makes the question ache is not just the what, but the why. Why embed star maps in myth? Why cloak mathematical truths in stories of gods and beasts and fallen empires? Why make the effort to preserve these alignments unless they mattered? Unless someone once told them they would. If a civilization had once reached great heights before falling into ruin, one of the first things it might try to preserve is time itself. Not hours and minutes, but deep time, the cosmic cycles, the celestial rhythms. Because knowing where you are in the sky is knowing when you are in history. It's knowing when to plant, when to build, when to prepare. A memory of the stars becomes a memory of the future. Maybe they were taught. Maybe the survivors of an older world passed the knowledge through stone and song, knowing that only certain things would endure. Maybe what we call myth was once curriculum. Maybe those who came from the stars weren't gods or aliens, but ancestors returning. Or maybe they were something else entirely, translators of the cosmos, walking libraries who looked up and saw not mystery, but memory. Even today, something stirs in us when we look at the sky, a sense of recognition that defies logic, a pull toward the resulted, constellations we cannot name. We've built machines to see further, to measure more precisely, but the old feeling remains that the stars are not only above us, but somehow a part of us. And as we dig through the ruins, decipher the glyphs, trace the alignments, we find the same truth told again and again. They knew. Long before us, long before history, they knew. And they left the knowledge where it could not burn, where it would not drown, where it would shine through even the darkest ages, etched in stone, sung in story, aligned with the sky, waiting, always, to be remembered. There is something about mountains that makes them feel eternal. They loom in myth and memory, like monuments left behind by gods. Their peaks disappear into cloud and snow, and yet they are strangely present, anchoring the land with a gravity not just of mass, but of meaning. Every ancient culture seemed to know this, not only as geography, but as story. Mountains were more than rock. They were homes of passes, the divine, thrones of sky beings, gates between worlds. Olympus in Greece, Kailash in Tibet, Meru in India, Sinai in the desert. These were not metaphors to the people who told their stories. They were real, physical places sacred not for their shape alone, but for what was believed to dwell within them. Mountains rise beyond the reach of ordinary life. They're places where the air thins and the world falls quiet, where fire can meet ice and not be extinguished. That isolation makes them natural sanctuaries, places where the veil between realms might feel thinner. But perhaps, long ago, that wasn't just a feeling. Perhaps mountains were chosen, not just revered, chosen for their altitude, for their line of sight to the stars, for their remoteness, chosen as bases of operation, repositories of knowledge, sanctuaries of survival. Mount Kailash, in the remote western reaches of Tibet, has never been climbed. Not because it is unclimbable. It is shorter than Everest and less treacherous than many peaks, but because the local people forbid it. They say it would be sacrilege, that the mountain is not merely holy, but inhabited. In Hindu tradition, Kailash is the home of Shiva, the god of transformation and time. In Jain belief, it is where the first Tirthankara attained liberation. Buddhists speak of it as the axis mundi, the world center, where heaven meets earth. It is not only sacred, it is alive, and those who circle it say that time itself moves strangely there, that watches tick faster, that people age differently. What kind of place does that? And why, across so many cultures, does one single mountain become a common node in their cosmologies? Then there's Mount Olympus, not a symbolic name, but a real peak in northern Greece, revered as the dwelling of Zeus and the pantheon of gods. The ancient Greeks didn't speak of it abstractly. They believed their gods literally lived atop it, shrouded in mist, hidden from mortal view. No one scaled Olympus in the classical age, and no one questioned that its summit was divine territory. It was understood that the gods required altitude, privacy, and sky. But if you peel back the metaphor, if you imagine, even for a moment, that Olympus was a station, a stronghold, a center of observation or command, it changes everything. What if the gods needed elevation for communication, not contemplation? In Mesoamerica, too, volcanoes were revered. Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the smoking mountain and the sleeping woman, were more than landscape. They were characters, lovers, sentinels. In Andean cultures, the highest peaks were Huacas sacred beings, not just stones. The Inca would leave offerings near the summits, sometimes even children, preserved in ice for centuries. These were not symbolic gestures. They were tributes to something very real, to presences they believed watched from above. Perhaps, in the earliest days after the Great Collapse, those who still remembered sought high ground for safety, not only from floods, but from the eyes of the broken world below. In that silence, they might build places of observation, of calculation, of ritual. The remnants of those places could still be hidden beneath ice or rock, or perhaps what they left behind was not structure, but story implanted in the culture so that future generations would not forget where the sacred still lived. There is also something else about mountains. They preserve. In the high altitudes, where oxygen is low and cold is constant, bodies mummify, metals remain untarnished, memory lasts. Perhaps that, too, was part of their draw. A place where things could survive, not just people, but tools, writings, mechanisms. The world below changes. But in the mountains, time slows down. Some traditions speak of the mountain not just as a home of gods, but as a place of origin. Mount Meru, said to be the cosmic mountain at the center of all physical and spiritual universes, rises in ancient texts as both literal and metaphorical. But its architecture is mirrored in Angkor Wat. Its concept is embedded in temple design across Southeast Asia. If Meru was only a myth, why replicate its shape so precisely in structures meant to last forever? Even in the Bible, the mountain is central. Moses receives the commandments on Mount Sinai. Elijah meets the divine on Mount Horeb. Jesus is transfigured on a high place. Mountains are where the voice of the divine breaks through, where law is given, where change is catalyzed. Not valleys, not cities, always the peaks. It is curious that for so many different peoples, mountains serve the same purpose: isolation, communication, elevation. Whether we call them homes of the gods or retreats of the wise, they seem always to be places where knowledge descends or is protected. And that raises a question. Were the mountains sacred because the divine was encountered there? Or was the divine encountered there because those who came before placed their memory high above, knowing that someday, far in the future, we would climb back up? Maybe the mountain is a message, not carved in words, but in form, a shape that draws the eye upward, that reminds the heart to look higher, not to worship stone, but to remember that long ago, someone stood there, not to pray to the summit, but to ask why so many before us believed that was where truth resided. It may be that the myths of sacred mountains are not simply symbolic tales of aspiration, but encoded coordinates, that the stories told around fires and altars were not dreams, but directions, and that the silence found at the top of the world still holds echoes waiting to be heard again. Because mountains do not shout, they wait. And if memory was ever hidden there, it would still be waiting too. They wind through every culture, slithering silently beneath temples, coiled around trees of life, sleeping in the depths of oceans, or soaring across the skies. Sometimes they guard treasure, sometimes wisdom. Sometimes they burn cities to ash. Sometimes they whisper the secrets of creation. From the feathered serpents of Mesoamerica to the cosmic nagas of India, from the Ouroboros that eats its own tail to the dragon kings of Chinese legend, the image is unmistakable. This being, scaled and ancient, twisting between worlds. No one taught the world to dream of serpents, and yet it did, everywhere, all at once. In many traditions, the serpent is not evil, but sacred. It is a keeper of balance, a symbol of renewal, a teacher of transformation. It sheds its skin and emerges new. In India, Kundalini is the coiled serpent at the base of the spine, the primal energy that, once awakened, spirals upward through the chakras to open the mind. It is not just a metaphor, it's a system of energy, described with precision, passed down through millennia, hinting at an inner flame that lies sleeping within the body, waiting to rise. In ancient Egypt, the uraeus, the rearing cobra, sat on the crowns of pharaohs, a symbol of divine authority and protection. The serpent wasn't crawling on the ground, it was worn at the third eye. In the book of Genesis, it is the serpent who offers knowledge, not destruction, not death, but awareness, a choice, a crossing from innocence into knowing. It is a story that has echoed far beyond its pages. For what is fire, if not the spark of civilization? And what is the flame guarded by dragons, if not the same forbidden light? In myth after myth, dragons hoard gold, relics, or sacred objects, not for greed, but because they are tasked to keep it from unworthy hands. In this telling, the dragon is not the enemy. It is the threshold, the final guardian between the seeker and the truth. Some scholars suggest the serpent is our earliest religious symbol, born of a time when humans watched snakes with awe and fear. Others argue it's a metaphor for celestial patterns, the winding Milky Way or the double helix of DNA, glimpsed in altered states or passed down from a long-forgotten science. The twin serpents of the caduceus, entwined around a staff, are still used as a symbol of healing today. Two opposing forces rising together toward enlightenment, balance, and restoration. There is a theory, whispered on the edges of archaeology and myth, that the serpent once meant more, that it represented not just knowledge, but those who brought it, that the dragon was not a beast of fire, but a teacher cloaked in mystery. that when the ancients spoke of serpent gods, they remembered something real, encoded in their blood, buried in the folds of their stories like a sleeping ember. Perhaps the forbidden flame was never meant to be forbidden at all, only protected, until we were ready. In the hush of myth, between verses and visions, there are stories that thrum with an odd kind of familiarity, descriptions of glowing chariots, weapons that roared like storms, cities in the sky that shimmered like stars, and voices of gods booming with the weight of thunder. To a listener wrapped in silence, those lines might sound poetic, but to a world surrounded by machines, by jets that tear the air, and engines that purr like lions, by skyscrapers rimmed in electric light, they begin to sound too remembered. Across the sweeping epic of the Mahabharata, weapons are not just bronze-tipped arrows or sharpened swords. They are celestial armaments, named deliberate and terrifying. The Brahmastra, for instance, is a weapon so powerful that it could incinerate a city. It was said to unleash a fire as bright as 1,000 suns. Its use left the land barren. Water boiled. Hair and nails fell from the bodies of those who survived. The unborn were harmed. Time itself felt disturbed. These aren't the effects of mythic magic. They read like the aftermath of radiation, of fallout, as if someone, somewhere in the deep shadows of history, saw a mushroom cloud and tried to describe it in the language they had. The Vimana, another word passed down in Sanskrit epics, is described as a flying chariot, sometimes small and maneuverable, sometimes vast and towering, like a palace in the sky. They were not imagined as illusions, but as real vehicles that carried the gods between heavens and earth. They shimmered, they spun, they made thunder when they moved, and they fought. There are stories of aerial battles, of beams of light striking from the clouds, of cities floating above the land. Could they be exaggerations of celestial dreams? Of course. But the consistency across cultures is hard to ignore. In Mesoamerica, the god Quetzalcoatl was said to have arrived in a flying craft. Some depictions show him seated inside what looks almost like a capsule, trailing fire. In Sumerian tablets, the Anunnaki descend from the sky in what are translated as celestial boats. The Egyptian sun god Ra sails through the sky on a great solar barquet, traveling from light to darkness and back. Again, these were not flights of poetic fancy. These were described as events. In Norse mythology, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was not just a weapon. It was a device that could flatten mountains, summon lightning, and always return to its bearer. It had to be wielded with iron gloves, as if it contained some powerful charge. In the Book of Enoch, angels are said to descend in machines that caused the earth to tremble. Their arrival was marked by smoke and noise, and their departure by fire. In the Bible, Ezekiel describes wheels within wheels, full of eyes, moving in impossible ways. Each of these accounts comes from different ages, separated by oceans, yet they all lean toward a curious intersection, divine power expressed through mechanics. What if these were not metaphors for thunder, or dreamscapes of a sky-staring species? What if they were memories of machines? Imagine a civilization that rose and fell long before our first recorded scripts. Imagine their knowledge compressed into oral traditions, passed like wildfire through generations. As the language of science was lost, all that remained were impressions: smoke, noise, fire, flight, power, misinterpreted as magic, precision remembered as wrath. Over time, the machines became myths, and myths became scripture. Perhaps the gods didn't fly because they were gods. Perhaps they were remembered as gods because they flew. When we look at the ruins of places like Pumapunku in Bolivia, where stones weighing hundreds of tons are cut with a precision we still struggle to replicate, or Baalbek in Lebanon, with its megaliths laid like blocks in a toy set made by giants, we must ask how. Not why, not when, but how. Not just in terms of cranes or levers or unknown tools, but in the possibility that the tools themselves were beyond what we associate with the ancient world. Tools that hummed or floated or sliced at the molecular level. Tools that weren't stone, but energy. The ancients were obsessed with the stars, but not just to gaze. They were tracking, measuring, mimicking. They built devices to move with celestial rhythms. The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a Greek shipwreck, is a clockwork calendar so intricate it challenges everything we assumed about ancient technology. It tracks planetary movement with gears that suggest forgotten predecessors. It's not that they had nothing before it, it's that this is what survived. And if this survived, what was lost? In old texts, the divine is often loud. It's described with rumbling, fire, metallic voice, unbearable brightness. These qualities don't suggest a whispering spirit. They suggest machinery. And if such machines were real, and once walked among early humans, the reaction would be understandable. Worship, fear, awe. The kind of awe that becomes story, passed on not to explain but to warn or to inspire. We may never find the machines themselves. Time corrodes, buries, and burns. But we might still be cradling their blueprints in our oldest myths. Stories of flying cities, of roaring engines, of skyborne battles may not be the dreams of a primitive mind, but the echoes of a memory too dangerous to forget and too wondrous to fully understand. A memory that says, we were not the first to build, only the first to forget. They say we came from the dust, that we were shaped from the soil, molded by divine hands, breathed into by gods or spirits or sky. But in nearly every corner of the world, there are older whispers that suggest something different. Not that we came from the earth, but that we arrived on it, that we were placed, seated, or perhaps returned, that our ancestors rode fire through the heavens, or were born of the stars, cast down from distant realms in ages when memory had not yet splintered into myth. In the myths of the Dogon people of Mali, there is a tale of amphibious beings, the Nomo, who descended from the sky in a vessel that spun and roared. They came from Sirius, not the bright star visible to the eye, but Sirius B, its faint white dwarf companion, invisible without a telescope. And yet the Dogon knew of its orbit, its weight, its density, long before Western science had confirmed its presence. This tribe carried its data not in textbooks, but in song. How did they know? The Hopi speak of star brothers, of ancestors who came from the sky and taught the clans the ways of balance. In Polynesian lore, gods descend from the Pleiades, their light woven into genealogy. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki arrive not metaphorically, but physically, from a place beyond the sky. They are not spirits. They are visitors, teachers, engineers, gene shapers. The Maya, too, trace their origins to starry places, their calendar attuned not just to seasons, but to galactic alignments. And in the oldest Chinese legends, emperors descend from dragons in the clouds, a code perhaps for flight, or for bloodlines not fully terrestrial. These myths are not isolated. They repeat, refrain-like, always pointing upward. Of course, the skeptic would say, this is projection, that every culture looked at the stars with longing, and in that longing imagined a home. But longing does not explain the precision. Longing does not explain the maps carved in stone of star systems only recently confirmed. It does not explain the sudden leaps, agriculture, metallurgy, architecture that seem to spark in clusters as though from contact. Longing does not leave traces in bone and blood. In our own DNA, there are puzzles, sequences that appear spliced, almost edited, traits that arose rapidly, without the slow, meandering crawl evolution usually takes. Our brain tripled in size in a geological blink, our vocal tract reshaped, our consciousness flickered on with stories of fire, of flight, of stars. There are cave paintings that show figures with halos or helmets, tablets that speak of beings with radiant skin, descending in fire and smoke. Gods who walk among humans, not ethereal, but tangible. Sometimes they are mistaken for giants, for angels, for demons, but always they are from elsewhere, from above. If Earth was once visited, not in spectacle, but in quiet seating, in whispers passed through the blood, what would the memory of that look like thousands of years later? It would not be a report. It would be a story, a lullaby, a warning. It would be encoded in our myths, buried like treasure in the subconscious, surfacing as archetype. It would be told around firelight as a tale of stars. There are places on this planet that feel like thresholds, where the stones are too precisely placed, where alignments speak to constellations, where legends say the sky opened and something stepped through. Places like Göbekli Tepe, older than cities, where animals and symbols spiral around central pillars as if marking a contact. Places like Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, aligned so perfectly to the stars that some believe it was built not by the living, but for the returning. Maybe the myths were never about where we are from in the bodily sense. Maybe they're reminders of where our spark began, because there is something in us that remembers light, something that reaches without knowing why, something that watches the night sky, not just for beauty, but for recognition, like looking into the dark and waiting for a flicker, for a home that may have once called us children. There are stories, whispered in the corners of ancient memory, that speak of a time before the moon, a time when the night sky was darker, emptier, and the tides were gentler, when the balance of day and night was different, and the world spun beneath a different rhythm. These are not modern musings or poetic metaphors. They come from old sources, from people who lived with stars in their stories and fire in their skies. From the Zulu in South Africa to the ancient Greeks, from the indigenous tribes of the Americas to the sages of Sumer, there exists a strange and consistent refrain that once the moon was not there. The Zulu speak of the moon as a craft, hollow and brought here long ago by beings known as the Wawane and Mpanku, two brothers from the stars. According to this tradition, the moon was rolled across the sky and placed in orbit, changing the balance of the earth. The pre-Columbian peoples of Colombia also passed down stories of an age before the moon. So did the Greeks, calling such people the proselenes, the ones who lived before the moon. Even the Bible, in poetic fragments, alludes to cosmic rearrangements. And in each of these echoes, something deeper pulses beneath the surface. The moon is more than a glowing disk. It is an anchor. Its gravitational pull steadies Earth's axial tilt, calms the climate, draws the oceans in and out in a breath that all life has adapted to. Its size, its distance, its effect on life is strangely perfect, too perfect perhaps, almost engineered. Unlike any other moon in our solar system, it is disproportionately large compared to its host. It does not behave as one would expect of a natural satellite. Its orbit is nearly circular, and its rotation so precisely locked that we see only one face forever. It does not seem like a rock that merely formed. It feels placed. When we landed on it and struck its surface, it rang like a bell. Seismic instruments placed by Apollo astronauts recorded reverberations that lasted for hours, suggesting a composition more hollow than solid. Mainstream science chalks it up to unique geology, but ancient myth makers, thousands of years earlier, were already calling it a vessel, a thing that arrived. If these myths are fragments of a memory, not just metaphor, what would it mean for Earth to have once known a sky without the moon? The length of days would have been shorter. Winds would have screamed across the continents in wilder patterns. The oceans, untethered, would have risen less, fallen less, leaving more coastal land, but less of the gentle cycles that nurtured complex life. Without the moon, the Earth would have been different, not just in landscape, but in life. Perhaps the presence of the moon wasn't an accident. Perhaps it was a turning point. If there was a time before it, it would have been a different epoch entirely. A world where the stars burned with clearer intensity, where humans, or something like them, looked up and saw not a familiar silver guide, but only endless night. A world older than memory, and perhaps older than us. We often think of the moon as a passive observer, silent, slow, beautiful, but to the ancients, it was powerful, alive, a being in its own right. The Greeks called it Selene, the Romans, Luna. The Hindus saw it as Chandra, a deity riding a chariot across the night. The Mayans tracked its cycles with surgical precision, aligning their temples and calendars to its every nuance. They watched it closely, not for superstition, but because they remembered it meant something. Perhaps they were watching not just a light, but a clock, a marker of a beginning. If the moon came after, if it was introduced into Earth's orbit in the hazy stretches of prehistory, it would explain why so many cultures seem to remember its arrival as a disruption. Floods, earthquakes, the sky turning red, a sudden change in balance. These are the stories that accompany the moon's appearance. Not joy, but upheaval. Not peace, but adjustment, as if Earth had to learn to live with it. And maybe we are the children of that adjustment, the beings who survived the shift or emerged from it, the ones who came after. It is easy to dismiss these tales as allegory, as the imagination of people trying to make sense of a vast and silent universe. But what if some of them are impressions, fossils in language of something real, a memory older than writing, older than myth? One passed through the bones and breath of those who saw the sky change and told the story the only way they could. They said there was a time before the moon, and then everything changed. There are fractures in our memory, not just individual but collective, places where the story doesn't just fade, it shatters, where something once stood, something enormous and real, but now there is only myth, scattered like ash in the winds of time. And in its place, we have legends of floods, fires, lost cities, angry gods, and sky-born punishments, tales told in song and stone and whisper, desperate not to forget, yet unable to fully remember. It's as if the world suffered a blow so vast, so soul-deep, that it buried its own past to survive the weight of remembering. Cataclysmic amnesia isn't a poetic idea. It is a psychological response observed in individuals, and there's every reason to believe cultures can respond the same way. When trauma overwhelms the brain, memory fractures. The facts remain buried, but the echoes linger, haunting dreams, phantoms of sensation, recurring patterns of fear and fixation. The psyche doesn't erase, it encrypts. Now take that mechanism and apply it to a planet. Imagine a world that watched its skies darken without warning. Meteors rained like fire, the ground split open, oceans heaved over continents, cities, languages, people vanished. The survivors, scattered, bleeding, blind with grief, would try to make sense of it all. But sense might not come. So instead, they do what humans always do when the world breaks. They'd tell stories. But they wouldn't call them reports or histories. They'd become myths, because trauma cannot survive in its raw state. It must be alchemized. So a comet becomes the eye of a god. A great wave becomes divine punishment. The trembling earth becomes the anger of titans. Survivors remember fragments, flashes an explosion of light, a shadow on the moon, a roaring wind. Children inherit those fragments, shaped into fables. Their children inherit the fables as sacred tales. And on it goes. The farther the story travels from the source, the more it wears a mask. But the bones of truth remain. Across cultures, the pattern is startling. A golden age, peaceful and advanced, ends in sudden violence. Fire falls from the heavens, waters rise, the sun disappears, giants flee. Beings of wisdom vanish into mountains, caves, or the sea. The people who survive crawl from the wreckage into a colder, harsher world, haunted by memory and sky. The Greeks called it the flood of Deucalion. The Hindus remember it as the pralaya, the great dissolution. The Maya told of multiple suns, each world destroyed and replaced. The Egyptians spoke of the first time, Zep Tepi, when gods walked among men before chaos broke the world. The Sumerians wrote of cities drowned, kings before the flood. The Norse remembered Ragnarok, not just as prophecy but as a thing that had already passed. The Bible spoke of Nephilim, of fire and brimstone, of towers reaching heaven and being broken. It's easy to dismiss these as coincidence, easier still to say they are symbolic. But what if symbolism is just a coping mechanism, a way of making the unbearable feel manageable? What if we are the descendants of those who chose to forget, who had to forget in order to rebuild? Because remembering might have shattered them entirely. We are conditioned to think of history as linear, a slow climb. But trauma breaks the line. It folds the page. And when we look back, what we see might not be where we truly came from, but the version we could handle. Some wounds don't scar over. They ripple through generations, encoded in our fears, our myths, our rituals. We bury relics under temples, align cities to the stars, repeat creation myths where gods fall and rise again. Why? Because some part of us remembers. The dreams of apocalypse, the obsession with rebirth, the instinctive reverence for fire, water, and sky. It's all part of the same story. We survived something. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a story. But stories like these don't come from nothing. They come from fire, from loss, from the urge to keep breathing when the world stops turning. Maybe that's why they're still with us, because somewhere in the silence, the memory still burns. Beneath the many tongues of the world, beneath the sharp consonants of ancient Semitic scripts, the flowing curves of Sanskrit, the clipped syllables of Latin, the forgotten breaths of proto-tribal speech, there lingers something older, a murmur, a structure, a hum at the base of all meaning. Languages evolve, yes, they fracture and adapt, but sometimes they echo something deeper than culture or convenience, something foundational, as if all our words are branches twisted and turned by time, but still reaching back toward the same unseen root. There are myths that suggest the ancients once spoke a single language, not just a tongue of trade or territory, but a sacred mode of thought, sound as precision, syllables as resonance. A language not only to describe the world, but to shape it. The Hebrews wrote of it as the language of Eden. The Vedas speak of primordial sound, the vibratory essence of being itself, Om, the tone from which all sprang. In Sumer, it was the divine speech, the utterance of the gods before Babel broke the harmony. And perhaps, in the silent ruins of forgotten civilizations, that language still waits. It may hide in the undeciphered the tablets of Rongorongo from Easter Island, where lines of glyphs curl like coded breath. Or the Phaistos disc, inscribed with spiraling symbols from a world we've never known. In the still unsolved symbols of the Indus Valley, where thousands of marks hint at complex meaning, but not one has yielded its voice. And in Linear A, the strange parent of Mycenaean script, no lexicon has yet cracked its code. What if we haven't been able to translate them, not because they are too primitive or too alien, but because they come from a logic too old for ours to grasp? Many ancient texts describe a time when words carried more than meaning, they carried force. Names were not just identifiers, but keys. To know the true name of a thing was to control it. To speak a word with the right intonation was to call it into form. This wasn't metaphor to them. This was practice. And if this ancient language once existed, it may have been more mathematical than poetic resonance over grammar, tone over syntax. Modern linguistics traces language families back through time, trying to map how they branched, fused, migrated. Indo-European roots stretch into Persian, Greek, Norse, and Hindi. Afro-Asiatic links Semitic and Berber. Sino-Tibetan binds Mandarin and Burmese. But the farther back we go, the blurrier it gets. Eventually, the map ends. But some theorists suggest that beyond this silence, there was a single proto-tongue, not a guessing game of grunts and gestures, but an elegantly constructed system, spoken by a people whose memory we've lost. This theoretical mother language, often called proto-world, would predate agriculture, predating empire, predating even myth. Some believe its traces may survive not just in shared phonemes, but in the way we think, the cognitive blueprint for how we build meaning. Patterns that echo unconsciously across every language. Archetypes not of story, but of sound. And if such a language did exist, who spoke it? Were they nomads, carving meaning into stone with no one left to remember it? Or were they something more? Those same first builders who aligned their cities with solstices and stars, who cut stones with inexplicable precision, who left no bodies but endless echoes. Perhaps their language was part of their technology, not separate from it, but embedded within. A civilization advanced not in our terms silicon and steel, but in harmonics, in symbolic resonance, in intention carried through sound. Their tools might have been words, their power, vibration. Even in today's languages, remnants may remain. Sacred chants across cultures share similar tones, mantras, psalms, invocations, words repeated not for meaning, but for frequency. Why? Because something in us still knows. And then there's the strange phenomenon of linguistic isolates languages with no known relatives. Basque, Ainu, Sumerian, Burushaski. Where did they come from? How did they survive? They stand like monoliths on the landscape of speech, unlinked, unmapped, fossils of an earlier mind. One that perhaps didn't think in categories or abstractions, but in relationships, in harmonies, in a different order of being altogether. If we could find that mother tongue, if we could somehow recover even a fragment, it might do more than solve a mystery. It might reawaken a part of ourselves, the part that speaks not only to each other, but to the world itself, that names the wind and is heard, that utters the pattern of a star and feels it, answer back. Some believe the key lies in sound, that before the first word was spoken, there was a tone, and that tone was truth. Maybe we've never stopped chasing it. Maybe every language is a dim reflection of that first utterance, a long echo, a search for a voice that once spoke the world into being and may one day speak it awake again. Sometimes, memory feels like a dream foggy around the edges, stitched together with flashes of clarity and fragments that don't quite fit. And yet, when we dream, we often wake with a strange certainty, as though we've glimpsed a truth just beyond the reach of language. The stories we've traveled through, the myths and monuments, the whispers of a time before time, they all carry that same texture. Not entirely fiction, not entirely fact. Like a memory from a life we don't consciously recall but feel in our bones. Are we remembering something real, or are we imagining what we wish had been? Maybe it's both. Modern science tells us that memory is imperfect. It is not a recording, but a reconstruction. Each time we recall something, we alter it slightly, reshaping it with new layers of emotion and context. Over generations, this becomes myth-making. A flood becomes a symbol. A god becomes a metaphor. A machine becomes magic. But perhaps, before the symbols, there was a truth. A civilization that fell. A world that cracked. A knowledge that burned so bright it left after images in our collective psyche. What if the reason these myths persist across continents, across cultures, across time, is not coincidence, but resonance? Somewhere deep in the unconscious mind of humanity, a story hums like a forgotten song. And no matter how many languages we speak, how many religions we follow, how far we drift from one another, that song returns in different forms. In dreams of sky beings and golden ages, of sacred mountains and burning skies, in tales of towers to the heavens, flying chariots, and gods who walked beside us, in legends of a fall, a flood, a fire, then silence. We call it imagination. But what if imagination is the instrument of memory? We often dismiss ancient stories as allegory because they don't fit our models of progress, because they speak in riddles and archetypes, because they survive where hard evidence does not. But evidence isn't always found in bones and bricks. Sometimes it's woven into the fabric of culture itself, into rituals, alignments, inherited fears, and recurring dreams. Sometimes it is the persistence of the story that is the proof. Because if this is all just invention, why do we keep inventing the same things? Over and over, across every continent, the pattern remains. Something high was brought low. Knowledge was given and lost. A world was changed forever. And we, the survivors, the descendants, the rememberers, have been trying to tell ourselves what happened ever since. Through symbols, through stone, through whispered prayers to stars. And yet, there's a danger in seeing too much, in connecting too many dots. The mind craves patterns. It sees faces in clouds and meaning in chaos. But perhaps the greater danger lies in refusing to look at all, in assuming that because something is ancient, it must be naive. Because it sounds impossible, it must be untrue. What if the myths are not fantasies, but encrypted memories? What if the dreams of Atlantis, the echoes of Babel, the stories of gods in sky and flame, what if they're the only records that survived? We stand now at the edge of remembering, with satellites instead of scrolls, with data instead of firelight. But we still wonder. We still look up and ask who we are, where we come from, and what we've forgotten. Maybe that's why these questions haunt us, because deep down, some part of us already knows, and it's not imagining, it's remembering.